Welcome to Warriors of the World. Today we'll be exploring the fascinating culture of the Jomsvikings, elite Viking mercenaries who supposedly lived by an unbreakable warrior code. Subscribe now to join our community and support this project. In the misty margins between history and legend exists one of Viking Age Scandinavia's most intriguing warrior brotherhoods, the Jomsvikings. According to Norse sagas and select medieval chronicles, these elite mercenaries established a fortress known as Jomsborg somewhere along the southern Baltic coast in the late 10th century, where they lived under strict martial discipline that surpassed anything known in the Viking world. Historian Judith Jesch, author of Ships and Men in the Late Viking Age, describes the Jomsvikings as the closest thing to a medieval military order that pre-Christian Scandinavia ever produced. The primary sources for the Jomsvikings come from several medieval Icelandic sagas, particularly the Jomsvikinga saga and sections of Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla. These accounts describe Jomsborg as a formidable fortress inhabited exclusively by warriors aged 18 to 50, bound by a code more rigid than traditional Norse values. According to Norse literature expert Jesse Byock, these texts present the Jomsvikings as idealized embodiments of warrior virtues, suggesting that even if the historical reality was less dramatic than the sagas portray, these stories reveal much about what Vikings themselves considered the perfect military brotherhood. The alleged founder of this warrior society was Palnatoke, a legendary Danish chieftain who reportedly established Jomsborg around 960. According to the sagas analyzed by historian Birgit Sawyer, Palnatoke designed Jomsborg as a perfectly organized military community where discipline replaced chaos, meritocracy supplanted birthright, and collective unity overcame individual glory, values that both complemented and contradicted traditional Viking society. This remarkable social experiment created what some scholars describe as a Viking Sparta on the Baltic shores. Archaeological evidence for the Jomsvikings remains elusive, leading to considerable scholarly debate about their historicity. Archaeologist Sven Rosborn points to the Polish town of Volyn, medieval Volyn, as the most likely candidate for Jomsborg, noting its strategic location at the mouth of the Oder River and archaeological remains suggesting a significant Viking presence during the 10th century. However, definitive proof linking Volyn to the saga descriptions of Jomsborg continues to elude researchers, leaving the Jomsvikings poised between confirmed history and enduring legend. Whether strictly historical or partially legendary, the Jomsvikings represent a fascinating evolution in Viking warrior culture. Military historian Ian Howard suggests that if they existed, they marked a transition from traditional Viking raiding parties based on personal loyalty to a professionalized military organization anticipating later medieval military orders. Their story resonates precisely because it embodies tensions within Viking society between individual heroism and collective discipline, between pagan warrior ethos and the organized warfare that would dominate medieval Europe. What truly distinguished the Jomsvikings from other Viking warriors was their supposedly strict code of conduct, unprecedented in Norse society. According to the Jomsvikinga saga, as translated by Norman Blake, members of this brotherhood lived under 5 fundamental laws that governed every aspect of their warrior lives. These rules created a military discipline far more rigorous than anything found among traditional Viking bands, whose loyalty typically centered on individual chieftains rather than abstract principles. The first and most sacred rule prohibited any Jomsviking from showing fear, regardless of the odds faced in battle. Historian Roberta Frank notes that while Viking culture certainly valued courage, this absolute prohibition against expressing fear represented an extreme interpretation of Norse warrior ideals. The sagas recount instances where Jomsvikings faced certain death with deliberate composure, turning their final moments into performances of fearlessness that would enhance their posthumous reputation. Equally significant was the prohibition against fleeing from any enemy of equal or inferior strength. According to medievalist Johanna Katrin Frerikster, this rule directly challenged traditional Viking tactical flexibility, which often involved strategic withdrawals and regrouping. The sagas describe battles where Jomsvikings refused advantageous retreats, their commitment to this principle ultimately leading to glorious death rather than survival through perceived cowardice. The third law mandated absolute equality among members, forbidding favoritism toward kinsmen in the distribution of spoils or selection for dangerous missions. Anthropologist Neil Price observes that this regulation directly contradicted standard Norse social structure, where kinship bonds typically dominated all other relationships. By demanding that Jomsvikings place brotherhood loyalty above family ties, this code created a revolutionary social organization within Viking society. A fourth regulation restricted membership to men between 18 and 50 years old, with exceptions only for extraordinary warriors who could prove their continued effectiveness. Military historian Kim Jarder suggests this age limit reflected practical concerns about maintaining peak fighting efficiency, distinguishing the Jomsvikings from traditional Viking bands that often included very young and elderly warriors. This restriction emphasized their identity as a professional military force rather than a typical Norse war band. The final and perhaps most distinctive rule prohibited Jomsvikings from spending more than 3 nights away from Jomsborg without permission from their leaders. As historian Anders Winroth notes, this requirement created a permanent standing force, contrasting sharply with the seasonal nature of typical Viking warfare. By maintaining a constant military presence, the Jomsvikings could launch operations year-round, giving them significant strategic advantages over traditional Norse raiders. Entry into the Jomsviking brotherhood was allegedly far more challenging than joining a typical Viking warband. According to the sagas analyzed by historian Else Rosdahl, prospective members faced rigorous testing designed to eliminate all but the most exceptional warriors. These trials supposedly assessed not only physical prowess but also mental fortitude and alignment with the Jomsviking code, creating an elite fighting force that transcended typical Viking military organization. The selection process began with a demonstration of martial skill. Saga accounts translated by Hermann Paulsen describe candidates facing multiple opponents in succession, testing their endurance as much as their technique. Unlike traditional Viking single combat, these trials emphasized sustained fighting ability over brief displays of prowess. Historian Regis Boyer suggests that if historical, these tests reflected the Jomsvikings' focus on battlefield effectiveness rather than individual glory. Following physical trials, candidates reportedly underwent psychological evaluation through carefully staged scenarios. The sagas recount instances where prospective members were placed in situations designed to test their courage, loyalty, and adherence to the Jomsviking code. Medieval literature scholar Carol Clover notes that these accounts, whether historical or literary, reveal Norse concepts of ideal warrior psychology, unflinching courage combined with rational self-control. Once accepted, new members entered a training regimen that blended traditional Viking skills with disciplined group tactics. According to military historian Paddy Griffith, the Jomsvikings were said to practice coordinated maneuvers rarely seen among Viking forces, which typically relied on individual heroics rather than tactical formations. This systematic approach to warfare, if authentic, would have given them significant advantages over less organized opponents. The Jomsvikings reportedly maintained their skills through constant drilling and mock battles within Jomsborg's walls. Norse warfare expert Stephen Pollington suggests that this continuous training cycle, unusual in Viking society where warriors typically alternated between farming and fighting, created a professional military competence unmatched in the Norse world. Such dedication to martial perfection aligned with the saga's portrayal of the Jomsvikings as the ultimate Viking warriors. Training extended beyond physical combat to include strategic education and leadership development. The sagas describe senior Jomsvikings mentoring younger members in the arts of command, navigation, and tactical planning. Historian Jonathan Shea notes that this institutional knowledge transfer, if historical, represented a significant evolution from traditional Viking practice where such skills were typically passed down within families rather than formal organizations. The legendary fortress of Jomsborg stands at the center of Jomsviking mythology, described in the sagas as an impregnable stronghold that housed this elite warrior brotherhood. According to translations by Lee Hollander, the fortress featured massive walls, a protected harbor capable of holding 300 longships, and sophisticated defensive systems that made it virtually unconquerable. These descriptions, while possibly exaggerated, suggest a military installation far more advanced than typical Viking fortifications. Archaeological investigations at Volyn, Poland, the most likely historical candidate for Jomsborg, have revealed evidence of significant Viking Age fortifications. Archaeologist the Ladislaw Filipowiak's excavations uncovered remains of a substantial 10th-century settlement with defensive structures and evidence of Scandinavian material culture. While these findings cannot definitively prove Volyn was Jomsborg, they demonstrate that a major Viking stronghold existed in the region during the appropriate period. The sagas describe Jomsborg's layout as perfectly designed for military efficiency. According to historian Else Rosdahl, the fortress allegedly contained barracks, training grounds, armories, and communal halls arranged to facilitate rapid mobilization. This organizational sophistication, if historical, would have represented a significant advancement over traditional Viking military camps, which were typically temporary and loosely structured. The harbor at Jomsborg reportedly featured innovative defensive mechanisms, including a massive iron chain that could be raised to prevent enemy ships from entering. Maritime archaeologist Ole Crumlin-Peterson notes that while such harbor defenses existed in medieval Europe, their attribution to a Viking fortress suggests either advanced engineering capabilities or literary embellishment reflecting later medieval practices projected backward onto the Viking Age. Life within Jomsborg's walls was supposedly governed by strict routine and hierarchy. The sagas describe a daily schedule of training, maintenance, and guard duties that maintained constant readiness. Social historian Judith Jesch observes that this regimented lifestyle contrasted sharply with the more fluid social structures of traditional Viking communities, suggesting either a revolutionary military organization or an idealized literary creation reflecting later medieval military orders. The fortress also allegedly served as a center for planning and launching military operations throughout the Baltic region. According to historian Niels Lund, Jomsborg's strategic location allowed the Jomsvikings to control vital trade routes and project power across northern Europe. This combination of defensive strength and offensive capability, whether historical reality or saga invention, made Jomsborg the embodiment of Viking military ambition. The military reputation of the Jomsvikings rests primarily on their participation in several legendary battles described in Norse sagas. The most famous of these encounters was the Battle of Hjörungavagr, fought around 986 against the forces of Håkon Sigurdsson, Earl of Lade. According to Snorri Sturluson's Heim Skringla, this naval engagement became the defining moment in Jomsviking history, testing their vaunted courage against overwhelming odds. The battle allegedly began when the Jomsvikings, hired by Danish King Harald Bluetooth to attack Norway, encountered Håkon's fleet in a Norwegian fjord. Saga accounts compiled by historian Sverre Bagge describe how the Jomsvikings, despite being outnumbered, maintained their formation and fought with characteristic discipline. The battle reportedly lasted an entire day, with neither side gaining decisive advantage until supernatural intervention, in the form of a hailstorm summoned by Håkon's pagan sacrifices, turned the tide against the Jomsvikings. Even in defeat, the Jomsvikings allegedly demonstrated their legendary courage. The sagas recount how captured Jomsvikings faced execution with defiant composure, engaging in witty dialogue with their executioners and showing no fear of death. Historian Roberta Frank notes that these execution scenes, whether historical or literary, perfectly embody the Jomsviking ideal of dying well, maintaining dignity and even humor in the face of certain death. Another significant campaign attributed to the Jomsvikings was their involvement in the dynastic struggles of Denmark during the late 10th century. According to medieval chronicler Adam of Bremen, the Jomsvikings played crucial roles in conflicts between rival Danish claimants, their mercenary services available to the highest bidder while maintaining their own strict code of conduct. This political neutrality, unusual in Viking society where personal loyalties typically determined allegiances, marked them as professional soldiers rather than traditional warriors. The Jomsvikings reportedly participated in raids throughout the Baltic region, targeting both pagan and Christian settlements. Historian Anders Winroth suggests that their operations extended from England to Russia, making them one of the most widely traveled Viking forces of their era. These far-ranging campaigns, if historical, would have required sophisticated logistical capabilities and navigational skills surpassing those of typical Viking raiders. The saga accounts of Jomsviking battles consistently emphasize their tactical discipline and coordinated fighting style. Military historian Paddy Griffith notes that descriptions of Jomsvikings maintaining shield walls under extreme pressure and executing complex maneuvers suggest either advanced military training or literary idealization of Viking warfare. Regardless of historical accuracy, these accounts reveal Norse concepts of perfect military execution. The historicity of the Jomsvikings remains one of the most debated topics in Viking studies. While the sagas present detailed accounts of their exploits, contemporary historical sources provide limited corroboration. Historian Birgit Sawyer notes that this discrepancy has led scholars to positions ranging from complete acceptance of the Jomsvikings as historical to dismissing them as purely literary creations. The primary challenge in establishing Jomsviking historicity lies in the nature of our sources. The main accounts come from sagas written centuries after the alleged events, raising questions about their reliability. Literary scholar Lars Lonroth argues that the Jomsvikinga saga, composed in the 13th century, reflects medieval Icelandic ideals projected onto a Viking past, potentially creating an idealized warrior brotherhood that never existed in the described form. Archaeological evidence from Volyn provides tantalizing but inconclusive support for Jomsviking existence. While excavations confirm a significant Viking presence in the region during the appropriate period, nothing definitively links these remains to the saga descriptions of Jomsborg. Archaeologist Przemysław Urbancic suggests that Volyn may have hosted a Viking trading settlement or military outpost that inspired later legendary elaborations. Contemporary medieval sources offer limited support for Jomsviking historicity. Adam of Bremen's 11th century chronicle mentions a Viking settlement called Jomn, possibly Jomsborg, but provides few details matching saga accounts. Historian Erik Christiansen argues that this sparse contemporary evidence suggests the Jomsvikings, if they existed, were less significant in their own time than later traditions suggest. Comparative analysis with other Viking military organizations provides perspective on Jomsviking plausibility. Historian Else Rosedal notes that while the described level of organization exceeds typical Viking practice, elements of the Jomsviking system, such as warrior brotherhoods and mercenary service, did exist in Viking society. This suggests the Jomsvikings might represent an extreme but not impossible development in Viking military evolution. Modern scholarly consensus tends toward viewing the Jomsvikings as a combination of historical kernel and literary elaboration. Historian Judith Jesch proposes that a historical Viking mercenary group based at Volyn likely inspired later saga writers to create an idealized warrior brotherhood embodying Norse martial values. This interpretation allows for both historical foundation and literary creativity in the Jomsviking tradition. Regardless of their historical reality, the Jomsvikings have exercised profound influence on perceptions of Viking culture and warrior ideals. Literary scholar Margaret Clunies Ross observes that the Jomsviking legend represents the culmination of Norse warrior values, creating an archetypal military brotherhood that continues to captivate modern imagination. Their story embodies tensions between individual heroism and collective discipline that resonate across cultures and centuries. In medieval Icelandic literature, the Jomsvikings became exemplars of warrior virtue, their supposed code providing a standard against which other Vikings could be measured. Saga scholar Theodore Anderson notes that references to Jomsviking-like behavior appear throughout Norse literature, suggesting their legend influenced broader concepts of ideal warriorhood. This literary impact extended beyond Iceland, influencing Scandinavian historical writing throughout the medieval period. The Jomsviking legend has experienced remarkable revival in modern popular culture. Historian Tom Shippey documents how contemporary novels, films, and games frequently feature Jomsviking-inspired warrior brotherhoods, attracted by their combination of historical mystique and clearly defined warrior ethics. This modern fascination reflects continuing interest in idealized military organizations that transcend mere violence to embody higher principles. Archaeological interest in identifying Jomsborg has spurred significant research into Viking-age Baltic settlements. Polish archaeologist Blażej Stanisławski notes that the search for Jomsborg has advanced understanding of Viking presence in the southern Baltic, revealing complex networks of trade, warfare, and cultural exchange. Whether or not Jomsborg is ever definitively identified, this research has enriched knowledge of Viking expansion beyond traditional Scandinavian territories. The Jomsvikings also provide valuable insight into the evolution of military organizations. Military historian Michael Prestwich suggests that the Jomsviking legend, whether historical or fictional, anticipates later medieval military orders like the Knights Templar. Their supposed combination of martial skill, religious dedication, to their code rather than Christianity, and communal living presages developments in European military organization. Academic debate over Jomsviking historicity has contributed to broader discussions about the relationship between history and legend in medieval sources. Historian Judith Jesch argues that the Jomsviking controversy exemplifies challenges in Viking studies, where legendary materials often preserve historical memory in complex ways. This ongoing scholarly discourse has refined methodologies for analyzing medieval texts that blend fact and fiction. Ultimately, the Jomsvikings represent more than a historical curiosity or literary creation. As historian Anders Winroth concludes, they embody an ideal that transcends their specific historical context, the vision of warriors bound by honor, discipline, and mutual loyalty rather than mere plunder or personal glory. Whether they patrolled the Baltic in historical reality or existed only in saga imagination, the Jomsvikings continue to influence our understanding of Viking culture and the universal appeal of warrior brotherhoods. Subscribe now, become a member, turn on notifications, share this video with your friends, and leave a comment so we can compare our knowledge and sources. Thank you for following our channel. Until our next strategic journey, here at Warriors of the World.